We can't be complacent about 1975. If the man sitting there had have said to the unions of Australia, "We're out on strike, boys, a government has been illegitimately dismissed," we could have seen massive conflict in Australian society. The system was pushed and pushed to the limits in terms of the public expectation of decency in politics. Why? Because we have this system of conventions and not a clearly codified set of powers for our head of state. In other words, the Republic and the relationship between the two Houses of Parliament. In other words, the Republic debate allows us to put on the agenda new ways of thinking, not just about government, but also about the functioning of Parliament. By separating the government from the Parliament, voters could be given a wider range of choices. Who do I want to be the President? Who do I want to be the Governor? Who do I want to be my Member of Parliament? Already electors have shown that such questions are very relevant to them when they vote for the Senate as opposed to the House of Representatives. It's important, however, that I put these proposals into a political context. I'm not arguing that the Australian government drop everything else and make political reform the sole focus for its legislative and policy development. I am saying be careful on proportional representation. If you did lock us into that, we wouldn't come out of it. Beware of direct democracy for the effect it will have on the ability to change things. But we still need a vision for the future. The vision for the future is more than the nightly news. What we need is a serious strategy for political change that distinguishes between short, medium and long-term initiatives. In the short term, it's important that the current case for a more constructive and policy-making Parliament be consolidated with real support and commitment. Couple this with the utilisation of new forms of public engagement where it is appropriate, and a strong message is already sent out to the community. We are changing. It will signal a turning of the tide. The current government has thus far rejected the full program of human rights reform recommended by the Brennan Committee. This indicates the role that right populist thinking plays within the ALP, either as a phenomenon to be feared or as an approach to politics that should be endorsed. However, like the Republic, the Charter of Rights won't go away as an issue. Resistance of its embrace on the grounds of popular opinion and the greater importance of the needs of executive government diminishes us as a political community. However, it is an issue that requires more advocacy and campaigning around the role such a charter can play, particularly in relation to the services provided by our public organisations. As the British Institute of Human Rights put it when reviewing the day-to-day functioning of the UK Human Rights Act, and I quote, "Too often, the Human Rights Act is associated with technical legal arguments or perceived to be limited to high-profile, sometimes spurious claims by celebrities and criminals. These case studies reveal a very different picture. They show how groups and people themselves are using not only human rights law, but also the language and ideas of human rights to challenge poor treatment and negotiate improvements to services provided by public bodies." Australia could do better. We're complacent about our belief in equal opportunity. And I think the story of Indigenous disadvantage tells us that our public institutions, in the health and education systems particularly, are not proactive enough on the question of equality of opportunity. Now, even though I can imagine difficulties of campaigning on questions of a charter, I see it as an important political reform because it talks to citizens about their wider responsibilities, just as the new forms of political engagement do. It institutionalises the values we purport to hold and makes it clear that the exercise of power is a most important business. It needs ethics and it needs sensible regulation. By requiring governments and lawmakers to think carefully about what they're doing, it has the potential to create greater confidence in the quality of outcomes. Once again, we've entered that territory we call trust in government. The move to a republic will require a longer process of consideration, but it ought to be taken. Only recently, I was in Kenya, a developing country, massive issues, major questions related to their last election and violence. They've completely changed their constitution following a lengthy dialogue in their community. Firstly, we need a vote on whether or not to have a republic. And secondly, we need to create a constitutional convention to consider the future government of the country. Properly engaging the people on that question is not only good in itself, but it also increases the chances for a consensus to emerge on the twin questions of democratic accountability and effective government. By way of conclusion, let me return to where I started. There is a level of disenchantment about and a degree of disengagement from Australian politics. It's neither uniform in its expression nor internally consistent in its arguments. There are overlapping currents and a range of complaints about the way our political class is discharging its responsibilities. The rigidity of their adversarialism, the narrowness of their agendas, their defensiveness when it comes to community engagement, and their attraction to the quick fix. Proportional representation or populism don't represent solutions. The disenchanted don't just want a better parliament, they want better and more principled government. That's why I believe a Charter of Rights and Responsibilities is necessary, alongside new and innovative forms of public engagement. I've sought to find that political reform formula that achieves the right mix between principle on the one side, our rights and responsibilities, and responsiveness on the other through through public engagement. So too, I think it's the case that our current method for producing cabinets is putting too great an emphasis on politics and not enough on creative administration. Good government built upon long-term strategic planning and administration has become a necessity if we're to secure our future. That's why the move to consider a republic should open up the debate to wider considerations than those we have inherited from Westminster. Indeed, isn't it interesting that two of the best developments in British politics in recent years, the Human Rights Act and devolution, challenged traditional Westminster thinking rather than endorsed it? Re-engagement shouldn't just be about giving electors what they want, as indicated by opinion polls. It requires leadership around the principles under which they are governed. Human rights, democratic accountability. Putting them together in a way that produces good and effective government requires a commitment to reform and a common sense attitude to what is required from our political system. Yes, the numbers matter, as do the proportions, but politics ought to be about more. Our long-term productivity and environmental sustainability, the rights of minorities and the marginalised, and the public interest in general. However, should the major parties not take up the challenge of political engagement and involve the population in a deliberative dialogue around these issues, there is a risk that our system will drift and make change very difficult, and may even take us back to a more insular, defensive and protectionist Australia. Re-engagement is not just about readjustment. It must also be about leadership and reform. On this conclusion, it will either stand or fall. Thank you very much.
And now it's my pleasure to call on the Hon. Bob Hawke to give the formal vote of thanks to Professor Gallop.
Your Excellency, Mrs. Scarce, Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, all the distinguished guests, dear friends, one and all. First, let me say again, as I always do in moving this vote of thanks, what great pride I take personally in the development of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, the great work it does, and within that, this very important annual event which you, the good people of Adelaide, always support so fully, and I thank you all very sincerely for your presence here tonight. We've always had good Hawke lecturers, and again we've had an excellent one tonight. I have more and more felt over recent years that we are in a dangerous, an increasingly dangerous situation in Australia, in that there is so much evidence of an increasing cynicism and indeed contempt for parliamentarians and indeed for the parliamentary process. And it's so good, Geoff, that you've addressed this issue from the basis of your great practical experience and your academic excellence. The problems, of course, are in two parts. There is the question of the quality of the members of Parliament, the way they behave within the Parliament, and of course there is the systemic questions as well. And Geoff, you have gone in considerable detail and with much imagination to these issues. May I just make a comment about two or three aspects of what Geoff has said, because they do ring a great chord with me. I hated Parliament.